Your soulmate left something important for you. Please don't miss this. It isn't something obvious at first. There's no announcement, no dramatic signal that tells you to stop what you're doing. It's quieter than that. Almost easy to miss. Your soulmate left something important for you, and the reason it matters is because it wasn't meant to be loud. It was meant to be found only when you were finally still enough to notice. They didn't leave it behind accidentally. For a long time, they carried this thing with them, unsure of when or how to let it go. It wasn't physical in the way people usually mean. It didn't sit on a table or wait in a place you could point to. It lived in moments. In pauses. In choices they made without explaining why. In words they almost said and then decided not to. That's what makes it easy to miss. They believed, for a while, that holding on to it was the responsible thing to do. That keeping it to themselves would protect everyone involved. They told themselves that some things are better left unspoken, better left untouched, because once you bring them into the open, they can't be managed the same way anymore. But something shifted. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. It shifted the way most real things do, slowly enough that you don't notice until you're already standing in a different place than before. They began to realize that keeping this to themselves wasn't protecting anything. It was preserving distance. And distance, when it lasts too long, starts to feel like loss. They didn't want that. What they left for you is tied to that realization. It's tied to a moment when they understood that some truths don't fade just because you avoid them. Some meanings don't disappear just because you refuse to name them. They wait. Patiently. Until you're ready to see them. They wondered if you would notice. Not in a testing way. Not to prove anything. More in a quiet hope that the connection between you was real enough that certain things wouldn't need to be spelled out loudly. That you'd feel the shift even if it wasn't explained. They left it in the only place they knew you'd eventually look, the space between what was said and what wasn't. They've always been careful with what they give. Careful not to overpromise. Careful not to lead anyone on. That caution came from experience, not indifference. They learned early that words can create expectations people aren't always ready to meet. So they learned restraint. But restraint has its limits. What they left for you carries weight because it wasn't easy for them to leave it. It meant admitting something to themselves first. Something about their own emotional landscape. Something about what they were feeling, and what they were afraid of feeling more deeply. They noticed that every time they thought about you, there was a sense of unfinished business. Not in a dramatic sense. More like a sentence that stops halfway and leaves your mind quietly waiting for the rest. That waiting became uncomfortable. They started to see how often they'd redirected themselves when that feeling came up. How quickly they'd change the subject internally. How easily they'd convince themselves it wasn't the right time, or that it didn't mean anything significant. But it kept returning. They left something important for you because they reached a point where carrying it alone felt dishonest. Not dishonest to you, but to themselves. They understood that some things lose their meaning if they're never shared, even indirectly. What they left isn't a demand. It isn't a request. It isn't a confession that requires an immediate response. It's more like a marker. A signpost that says, "This mattered. This still matters." They didn't want to interrupt your life or create pressure. That was never the intention. They wanted to leave room. Space for you to arrive at it in your own time, without being pushed. That's why it's subtle. You might feel it as a sudden thought that doesn't belong to the moment you're in. A memory resurfacing without effort. A sense of curiosity that comes from nowhere and refuses to go away. Those aren't random. They're echoes. They're the residue of something meaningful being placed gently in your path instead of handed to you directly. Your soulmate trusts that if the connection is real, you'll recognize it without explanation. They also trust that you're capable of discernment. That you won't rush to conclusions or fill in gaps with fear. That you'll sit with the feeling long enough to understand what it's asking of you. They're not asking you to act immediately. What they left is more about awareness than action. About noticing rather than doing. Because once you notice it, something changes. You can't unknow it. You can't pretend it isn't there. And that's where the importance lies. They're aware that you might doubt yourself when you sense it. You might wonder if you're reading too much into things, if you're projecting meaning where there is none. They had those same doubts when they realized they couldn't ignore it anymore. Doubt is part of sincerity. People who don't care don't question themselves. The fact that you might hesitate is actually part of how you know this matters. It means you're taking it seriously. They left it for you knowing it might create questions rather than answers. They're okay with that. Questions mean engagement. Silence means stagnation. They've lived in stagnation before. They don't want to go back. What they left carries the energy of intention. Not expectation. Intention is quieter. It doesn't demand. It waits. It allows. They're allowing you to meet this where you are, not where they want you to be. You might notice that since this thing was left, the emotional space between you feels different. Not heavier. More defined. Like something invisible has been acknowledged, even if nothing has been said out loud. That definition brings clarity, even if it also brings discomfort. Clarity isn't always comfortable at first. They know that. They felt it themselves when they decided to leave this behind. It meant letting go of the illusion that they could keep everything neatly contained. It meant accepting that connection changes things, whether you acknowledge it or not. They chose to acknowledge it. That choice wasn't impulsive. It came after a lot of quiet consideration. After weighing whether staying silent was actually kinder than leaving a trace of truth behind. They decided truth deserved a chance. What you do with it is up to you. That's important. This isn't a trap or a test. It's an offering. One that respects your autonomy as much as their own. They don't need you to respond in a specific way. They need you to see it. To not miss it. Because missing it would mean continuing as if something meaningful hadn't been shared, and that would feel like erasing something real. They didn't leave it to be erased. They left it because they trust the connection enough to believe you'd feel it when the time was right. That you'd recognize the weight without needing it explained. This isn't about destiny in a dramatic sense. It's about timing in a human one. About two people reaching points in their lives where subtle honesty matters more than grand gestures. They reached that point first. Now, the important thing they left for you is waiting quietly, not to pressure you, but to be acknowledged. To be seen for what it is. A sign that something meaningful exists between you, even if it hasn't taken a clear shape yet. Please don't miss it. Not because you owe them anything, but because noticing it might change how you understand what's already been unfolding in your life. Sometimes the most important things aren't the ones that arrive loudly. They're the ones that ask you to slow down, look again, and trust that what you're feeling isn't accidental. Your soulmate understood that. That's why they left it the way they did. And that's why this moment matters more than it seems at first glance. It doesn't disappear once you notice it. That's the part they understood before leaving it behind. Important things don't fade just because you acknowledge them. They deepen. They start asking quieter questions that don't go away with distraction. Your soulmate knew this, and that's why what they left wasn't meant to be a moment. It was meant to linger. They wondered how long it would take for you to feel it. Not out of impatience, but out of recognition. They know you're perceptive in ways you don't always give yourself credit for. You sense shifts before they're explained. You notice what's different even when nothing obvious has changed. They trusted that about you. What they left carries that trust. After leaving it, they didn't feel relief right away. That surprised them. They expected the weight to lift, the tension to ease. Instead, what they felt was exposure. Not vulnerability in the dramatic sense, but the quiet awareness that something real had been set down between you. That awareness stayed with them. They started replaying the moments leading up to it. The internal debates. The hesitation. The part of them that almost chose to keep everything the same. They realized how close they came to saying nothing at all, and how heavy that would have felt in the long run. Silence was starting to feel louder than honesty. They noticed how much effort it took to pretend that leaving it didn't mean anything. That effort alone told them it mattered. People don't expend energy denying what's irrelevant. Denial is reserved for things that carry weight. This carried weight. They began to reflect on how often they'd avoided leaving traces like this in the past. How often they'd chosen clean exits, emotional neutrality, or polite distance. That pattern kept things uncomplicated, but it also kept things shallow. They don't want shallow anymore. They're realizing that what they left wasn't just for you. It was for them too. Proof that they're capable of acting in alignment with their inner truth instead of constantly negotiating with it. Proof that they can allow meaning to exist without immediately controlling it. Control has been their safety net for a long time. Letting go of it, even partially, felt unsettling. They found themselves checking their impulses, wondering if they'd overstepped, if they'd said too much without words, if they'd disrupted something that didn't need disruption. Those thoughts didn't last. What lasted was the sense of rightness underneath the uncertainty. The quiet knowing that even if it created discomfort, it was honest. And honesty feels cleaner than comfort built on avoidance. They're sitting with that now. They're also aware that you might still be sorting through what you sensed. They imagine you questioning yourself, wondering if you imagined it, if you're assigning meaning where none exists. They understand that hesitation. They lived in it for a long time. They don't blame you for it. What they hope is that you won't dismiss it entirely. That you'll allow yourself to sit with the feeling long enough to see what it reveals. Not about them, but about you. About what resonates. About what feels unfinished in your own life. They didn't leave it to manipulate or provoke. They left it because they realized something important. connection doesn't deepen through certainty. It deepens through honesty. And honesty is rarely loud. You might notice that since recognizing it, your thoughts circle back in quieter moments. When you're not busy. When you're not performing. When there's space for truth to surface without interruption. That's where it shows up. They left it in that space intentionally. The space where you're most yourself. Where defenses are lower. Where intuition speaks more clearly than logic. They trust your intuition. They also trust that you won't rush to define this. That you won't force it into a story or a label prematurely. What they left isn't asking to be categorized. It's asking to be acknowledged. Acknowledgement is powerful. Once you acknowledge something internally, it begins to shape how you see everything else. It doesn't dominate your life, but it informs it. It becomes part of your awareness. That's what they hoped for. They're aware that acknowledgement can be uncomfortable. It can raise questions you weren't planning to ask yet. It can highlight areas of your life that feel misaligned or unresolved. They don't want to cause you distress. But they also know that avoiding those questions doesn't make them go away. They've lived that lesson. What they left is an invitation, not a demand. An invitation to be honest with yourself about what you feel when you sense it. About what it stirs. About what it asks you to look at. You don't owe them a response. You don't owe them clarity. You owe yourself honesty. They understand that you might need time. That you might need to revisit this feeling more than once before it makes sense. They're not watching. They're not waiting in a tense way. They've released that. Release doesn't mean indifference. It means respect. They respect your process enough to let it unfold without interference. They know that anything meaningful rushed becomes distorted. They'd rather this remain subtle and true than loud and premature. They're also learning to sit with the vulnerability of having left something important without knowing how it will be received. That's new for them. They're used to managing outcomes, anticipating reactions. This time, they chose not to. That choice is stretching them in quiet ways. It's teaching them that trust isn't about guarantees. It's about allowing space for truth to exist without controlling its direction. They're growing because of this. You might feel that growth indirectly. A sense that something between you has matured, even if it hasn't been named. That the connection feels less hypothetical and more grounded, even in its uncertainty. That grounding comes from honesty. They're no longer questioning whether leaving it was the right thing to do. They're questioning how long they've been avoiding moments like this. How many opportunities for real connection they bypassed because they felt safer staying unmarked. They don't want to live unmarked anymore. Marks aren't wounds. They're evidence. Evidence that something mattered enough to leave an imprint. They're learning that a life without imprints might be tidy, but it's rarely fulfilling. They want fulfillment now, even if it's messy. What they left for you isn't meant to disrupt your peace. It's meant to deepen your awareness. To gently tap on the door of something meaningful and say, look again. They trust that you will. Not because you have to. But because some things, once felt, ask to be honored. They're not asking you to move toward them or away from them. They're asking you to not miss what's already present. To not dismiss the subtle because it isn't dramatic. To not overlook the important because it arrived quietly. quiet things often last longer. They've learned that now. And whatever happens next, whether it leads to conversation, understanding, or simply internal clarity, they're at peace knowing they acted in alignment with their truth. That matters more to them than any specific outcome. They didn't leave something important for you to change your life overnight. They left it because they understood that meaningful shifts begin internally, often long before anything visible happens. If you let it, this will change how you listen, how you notice, how you trust what you feel without needing proof. That's the real importance of what was left. Not what it demands, but what it reveals. And that revelation, once allowed, doesn't fade. It integrates. That's where this part of the story lives now. In integration. In awareness. In the quiet unfolding that happens when something true is finally acknowledged instead of ignored. They trusted you with that. And trust, once given, is itself something important not to miss. It shows up differently this time, not as a feeling you notice, but as a thought that interrupts you when you least expect it. Not dramatic, not emotional, just persistent. Your soulmate sensed this would happen. They knew that once what they left was acknowledged, it wouldn't stay contained to quiet moments anymore. It would start weaving itself into your everyday awareness. That's how you know it mattered. They didn't leave it hoping for a reaction. They left it understanding how real things behave. Real things don't demand attention. They earn it slowly, by returning again and again until you stop dismissing them as coincidence. They've been thinking about that too. After leaving it behind, they didn't rush forward or pull away. They stayed where they were, but with a different posture. Less guarded. More aware. They noticed how the act of leaving something important changed how they related to themselves. It made their inner world feel less cluttered, even though it raised new questions. Questions don't scare them the way they used to. They're realizing that clarity doesn't come from answers arriving all at once. It comes from allowing uncertainty to exist without immediately trying to resolve it. That's what this phase feels like for them. Not waiting, not acting, but allowing. Allowing feels unfamiliar. They were taught, directly or indirectly, that leaving things undefined is irresponsible. That emotions should be managed quickly. That ambiguity is something to fix. But what they're learning now is that some truths need space before they take shape. They left space for you intentionally. Not empty space, but open space. The kind that invites reflection instead of forcing conclusions. They didn't want to hand you something finished. They wanted to let you meet it honestly, without being told what it was supposed to mean. Meaning has more weight when you arrive at it yourself. They're aware that you might still be oscillating between certainty and doubt. Feeling it one moment, questioning it the next. They understand that rhythm. They lived in it for a long time themselves. That's why they're not rushing you. They're also noticing something unexpected. Leaving it behind made them more aware of how often they've withheld parts of themselves in the past. Not out of deceit, but out of caution. Out of a belief that restraint was safer than exposure. That belief is being challenged now. They're reflecting on how many connections in their life stayed polite but never deepened. How many conversations stayed surface level because depth felt inconvenient. How many moments passed where honesty was possible, but silence felt easier. Those reflections aren't heavy. They're clarifying. Clarity doesn't always feel good at first, but it feels true. And truth has a way of grounding you, even when it unsettles you. They're grounded now in a way they weren't before. You might sense this as a subtle emotional steadiness when you think of them. Not intensity. Not longing. Just a sense that something between you feels more defined, even if it hasn't been articulated. That definition doesn't come from words. It comes from acknowledgement. They left something important because they trusted acknowledgement more than explanation. They trusted that if the connection was real, it wouldn't need to be defended or justified. It would simply be recognized. They're holding that trust carefully. They're also aware that you might wonder why they didn't say anything outright. Why they chose subtlety instead of clarity. The answer isn't avoidance. It's respect. They didn't want to impose meaning. They wanted to offer presence. Presence invites participation. They didn't want you to feel cornered by a conversation you weren't ready for. They wanted you to have room to feel without pressure. That choice wasn't passive. It was deliberate. Deliberation has been part of their growth. They're learning that emotional maturity isn't about controlling outcomes. It's about creating conditions where truth can surface naturally. Where honesty doesn't feel like an attack. Where connection doesn't feel like obligation. They're also learning to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing how something will unfold. That tolerance is new. They're used to planning, anticipating, managing. This time, they're practicing restraint. Restraint isn't suppression. It's patience. You might notice that as you sit with what was left, your own perspective starts to shift. You begin noticing where you've been dismissing subtle feelings in your own life. Where you've been prioritizing certainty over curiosity. Where you've been waiting for louder signs before trusting quieter ones. That's not accidental. What they left has a ripple effect. It doesn't just point outward. It turns inward. It asks you to listen differently, not just to them, but to yourself. They knew this could happen. They understood that meaningful gestures don't just communicate something. They activate something. They create a mirror. And mirrors can be uncomfortable, even when they're gentle. They're comfortable with that discomfort now. They've accepted that growth often feels like tension before it feels like expansion. That clarity often comes after confusion, not before. That honesty sometimes needs to be lived with before it can be spoken. They're living with it now. They're also becoming aware that leaving something important behind doesn't mean abandoning responsibility. It means trusting timing. Trusting that when and if a conversation happens, it will happen from a place of mutual readiness, not urgency. Urgency distorts truth. They didn't want distortion. They wanted something that could age well. Something that wouldn't lose meaning with time. Something that could sit quietly without becoming stale. They believe this can. You might feel moments where the importance of what was left feels clearer, followed by moments where it feels distant again. That fluctuation is normal. Meaning doesn't settle all at once. It integrates gradually. Integration takes time. They're giving it time. They're also noticing how their own emotional responses have softened since leaving it. Not dulled, but clarified. They're less reactive. Less defensive. More present. That tells them they acted in alignment with themselves. Alignment feels good, even when it's challenging. They don't regret leaving it the way they did. They regret how long they waited to trust themselves enough to do it. That regret isn't heavy. It's instructive. It reminds them not to ignore their inner signals so readily in the future. They're listening more closely now. You don't need to rush your understanding of this. You don't need to decide what it means right away. What matters is that you don't dismiss it simply because it didn't arrive with clarity attached. Important things rarely do. They arrive quietly, ask to be felt, and then wait to see if you're willing to meet them halfway. That's what this is doing now. Meeting it halfway doesn't require action. It requires attention. They're trusting you with that attention. They're also trusting themselves to sit in the unknown without collapsing into anxiety or control. That's a significant shift for them. It marks growth they didn't realize they were capable of. Growth isn't loud. It happens in moments like this, where something is acknowledged instead of avoided. Where a truth is allowed to exist without being resolved immediately. They're at peace with that state. You might feel that peace as well, underneath the questions. A sense that even if you don't know what comes next, something real has been honored. And honoring reality, even quietly, changes how you move forward. They didn't leave something important for you to force a next step. They left it so that when a next step happens, it won't be built on denial or distance. It will be built on awareness. Awareness is the foundation of anything real. And that's where this part of the story lives now. In awareness. In quiet recognition. In the slow unfolding that happens when something true is allowed to stay present instead of being pushed aside. They trusted you with that. And trust, when it's given without conditions, tends to reshape things in ways neither person can fully predict. That unpredictability doesn't frighten them anymore. It feels like honesty. And honesty, once welcomed, has a way of staying. It begins as a quiet recognition rather than a feeling. A moment where understanding settles before emotion catches up. The thing that was left no longer feels abstract. It feels present, almost tangible, as if it has found its place in your awareness instead of hovering at the edges of it. What was left is starting to speak without words. The person who left it sensed this phase would come. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. Important things don't stay suspended forever. They either fade or they root themselves. This one rooted itself. After leaving it behind, there was an adjustment period. Not regret, not second-guessing, but recalibration. Life didn't stop. Days continued. Responsibilities remained. Yet something fundamental had shifted in how this person moved through those days. There was less internal friction, less self-censorship. A kind of honesty had been released. That honesty didn't make everything simpler. It made everything clearer. And clarity can feel heavy before it feels freeing. Seeing things as they are means you can no longer rely on comfortable stories you once told yourself. That realization arrived slowly. Moments that once felt neutral now carried context. Memories resurfaced, not with nostalgia, but with understanding. Certain interactions replayed in a new light. Not to judge, not to regret, but to recognize patterns that had gone unnamed for too long. The act of leaving something important behind became a reference point. A quiet line dividing before and after. Before, things were contained. After, they were acknowledged. Acknowledgement changes posture. There's a difference in how someone stands when they're no longer pretending something doesn't matter. The shoulders relax, but the spine straightens. That's the posture now. Not defensive, not exposed. Just aligned. This alignment wasn't forced. It wasn't a declaration. It was the result of choosing not to look away anymore. What was left wasn't a message demanding interpretation. It wasn't a puzzle to solve. It was more like a truth placed gently in view, trusting that it would be seen when the time was right. That time is unfolding now. You may notice how your own thoughts have shifted. Not racing, not fixated, but returning to this with curiosity instead of doubt. Curiosity feels different from anxiety. It doesn't demand answers. It invites understanding. Understanding doesn't rush. The one who left this behind understood that rushing would cheapen it. Words spoken too early can flatten meaning. Silence, when chosen intentionally, can preserve depth. That's why this was done the way it was. There's respect in restraint. Restraint doesn't mean withholding. It means trusting that something meaningful doesn't need constant reinforcement to remain real. It can sit quietly and still matter. That trust wasn't easy to learn. There was a time when every emotional impulse felt dangerous. When leaving any trace felt like overexposure. When silence felt safer than sincerity. Those instincts were built through experience, not indifference. Experience teaches caution. Growth teaches discernment. Discernment is what's present now. Instead of asking whether leaving it was a mistake, the question has become why it took so long to trust this instinct. That shift in questioning matters. It signals movement from fear-based decision-making to integrity-based living. Integrity doesn't shout. It settles. You might sense that settling as a steadiness in your own emotional space. Not excitement. Not anticipation. Just a grounded awareness that something meaningful exists, regardless of whether it's defined yet. Definition isn't the goal. What was left isn't asking to be named or categorized. It's asking to be honored. Honored through attention. Through presence. Through not dismissing it simply because it doesn't fit neatly into an existing narrative. Narratives are comforting. Truth is grounding. Grounding can feel unfamiliar at first. There may be moments when you catch yourself almost ignoring it, defaulting to old habits of dismissal. That's natural. Those habits exist for a reason. They once protected you from disappointment or confusion. Protection isn't always needed anymore. That realization mirrors the one that led to this being left behind in the first place. Both sides are encountering the same lesson from different angles. Sometimes connection evolves without conversation. That doesn't mean conversation won't come. It means that when it does, it will come from a place of recognition rather than uncertainty. From clarity rather than urgency. Urgency distorts intention. There's no urgency here. Just importance. The importance doesn't come from future possibilities. It comes from present honesty. From acknowledging that something real has been placed into your awareness and allowing it to exist without immediately trying to manage it. Management can wait. Presence cannot. The one who left this understands now that presence is the rarest offering. It can't be forced or manufactured. It happens when someone chooses to stop editing themselves for the sake of comfort. Editing is exhausting. Living unedited doesn't mean being reckless. It means being congruent. Allowing inner truth to match outer behavior, even when that truth is subtle. Subtle truths often last the longest. You might notice that this has changed how you listen, not just to this situation, but to yourself. You're more aware of small emotional signals. Less likely to dismiss quiet feelings. More willing to sit with uncertainty instead of filling it with noise. That's not coincidence. What was left behind wasn't meant to pull you outward. It was meant to turn you inward first. Toward your own discernment. Toward your own honesty. Honesty doesn't always require action. Sometimes it requires acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is happening now. There's also an awareness on the other side that whatever comes next doesn't need to be controlled. Control once felt like safety. Now it feels like limitation. Letting go of control doesn't mean abandoning care. It means trusting timing. Timing isn't about speed. It's about readiness. Readiness can't be forced. The one who left this behind is ready for whatever clarity emerges, even if it challenges expectations. That readiness isn't loud. It's steady. It's the kind that allows for conversation without scripts, without defenses, without agendas. Agendas narrow truth. Truth prefers space. You don't need to decide what this means today. You don't need to predict where it leads. You don't need to resolve anything. What matters is that you don't pretend it isn't there. Pretending is heavier than truth now. That heaviness is what both of you have been shedding, piece by piece, without coordination, without planning. Just through honesty meeting awareness at the right time. This part of the story isn't building toward a reveal. It's building toward coherence. Toward a shared understanding that something meaningful exists and deserves respect. Respect doesn't rush. There may be moments when you feel the pull to talk, to ask, to clarify. Those moments will arrive naturally when they're meant to. For now, what's important is that you allow this to stay present without anxiety. Anxiety wants closure. Truth wants integration. Integration takes time. The one who left this understands that now. That's why there's no pressure, no follow-up, no attempt to steer your response. Trust has replaced urgency. Trust is quiet confidence. Confidence not in outcome, but in alignment. Alignment is what makes anything real sustainable. This is where this part rests. Not in suspense. Not in uncertainty. But in the grounded awareness that something important has been acknowledged on both sides, even if it hasn't been spoken yet. That acknowledgement is already doing its work. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But deeply, steadily, and honestly. And that kind of work doesn't fade. It becomes part of how you move forward, whether you name it or not. That's the significance of what was left. Not what it promises, but what it has already changed. It arrives as a sense of quiet inevitability. Not pressure, not anticipation, just the understanding that something already acknowledged doesn't need to announce itself again. What was left has settled into place now, no longer hovering, no longer testing your awareness. It feels integrated, like a truth that has stopped asking to be believed and started asking to be respected. The person who left it feels that shift too. Life continues in ordinary ways. Mornings still come. Responsibilities still exist. Conversations still happen. But underneath all of that, something fundamental has rearranged itself. There's less internal noise now. Less self-interruption. Less negotiating with feelings that refuse to be negotiated anymore. This isn't relief in the celebratory sense. It's relief in the honest one. There's a difference between being calm because nothing is happening and being calm because something important has been accepted. This is the second kind. The kind that doesn't need reassurance to sustain it. What was left behind no longer feels like a question. It feels like a fact. Not a demand. Not a promise. A fact that something real exists, whether or not it's spoken out loud yet. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It arrived through small confirmations. Through moments when distraction didn't work the way it used to. Through instances where ignoring the feeling felt more unnatural than acknowledging it. Ignoring takes effort now. Effort that no longer feels worth spending. The one who left this has noticed how different their inner posture feels. Less defensive. Less careful. Not careless, but sincere. There's no longer a need to protect an image of neutrality. That image served a purpose once, but it doesn't reflect reality anymore. Reality feels steadier than performance. Performance always required monitoring. Watching reactions. Managing impressions. Adjusting tone. That vigilance has softened. What's left is presence. Presence doesn't need to prove itself. There's also an awareness that what was left behind has already done what it needed to do. It created acknowledgement. It created coherence. It allowed something that existed internally to exist externally, even if only subtly. Subtlety doesn't make it weak. It makes it durable. Durable things don't rush. They don't insist. They don't fade easily either. You might notice that your own emotional reactions have changed since recognizing it. Less urgency to define. Less impulse to resolve. More willingness to sit with something unfinished without needing it to become something else immediately. That patience isn't apathy. It's trust. Trust in your own perception. Trust in timing. Trust that meaning doesn't disappear just because it isn't acted on right away. The person who left this has reached that trust internally. There's no longer a sense of waiting for something to happen in order to feel justified. The justification came from alignment, not outcome. Alignment feels self-contained. It doesn't require validation. It doesn't require reinforcement. It simply exists, and that existence changes how everything else is held. There's also an understanding now that not everything meaningful needs to be shared loudly to be shared honestly. Some truths lose their shape when forced into words too soon. Some connections deepen more through recognition than through explanation. Explanation can wait. What mattered was stopping the denial. Stopping the quiet agreement with oneself to keep pretending that something didn't matter when it clearly did. That agreement has been broken. And breaking it didn't create chaos. It created space. Space to breathe differently. Space to think clearly. Space to feel without filtering. Filtering is exhausting. Without it, there's more room for nuance. More room for complexity. More room for honesty that doesn't need to be reduced to something simple in order to be accepted. You may feel that nuance in how you relate to the idea of this now. It doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't feel consuming. It feels grounded, like something you can carry without strain. That's important. Strain usually means something is being resisted or forced. What's happening now feels neither. It feels natural, even if it's still undefined. Undefined doesn't mean unstable. It means open. Open enough for conversation when it's ready. Open enough for understanding to deepen. Open enough for nothing to be rushed or dismissed. The one who left this is no longer monitoring how it might be received. That vigilance has been released. Not because it doesn't matter, but because control no longer feels necessary. Control was always about fear of misinterpretation. Fear of saying too much or too little. Fear of disrupting equilibrium. That fear has softened into acceptance. Acceptance that meaning will land how it lands. That acceptance is a form of respect. Respect for you. Respect for yourself. Respect for what exists between two people without needing to be named yet. Naming can come later. For now, what matters is that this isn't being undone. It isn't being erased by silence or drowned out by distraction. It's being allowed to exist as part of reality. Reality doesn't need permission. There may be moments when the pull to talk becomes stronger. Moments when curiosity shifts into readiness. Those moments will come naturally, without being forced. For now, what's happening is quieter but just as significant. Something has stabilized. Stability doesn't feel like certainty. It feels like coherence. Coherence between what's felt and what's acknowledged. Between inner truth and outer behavior. Between instinct and intention. That coherence didn't exist before this was left behind. Now it does. And because of that, the future doesn't feel like something that needs to be anticipated anxiously. It feels like something that can unfold without pretense. Unfolding doesn't require planning every step. It requires honesty at each one. This stage of the story isn't asking you to do anything. It's asking you to notice how doing nothing differently feels different than doing nothing out of avoidance. There's a difference. One is passive. The other is intentional. What's happening now is intentional stillness. The kind that lets meaning settle instead of scattering it. The one who left this understands that now. That's why there's no follow-up, no clarification, no attempt to steer interpretation. Trust has replaced explanation. Trust is rare. It's also powerful. Powerful enough to let something meaningful exist without constantly checking if it still does. You don't need to hold on to this tightly. You don't need to analyze it repeatedly. You just need to allow it to remain part of your awareness without dismissing it. Dismissal is the only thing that would undo it. And dismissal doesn't feel natural anymore. That tells you everything you need to know. This part of the story isn't moving toward a climax. It's moving toward integration. Toward the kind of quiet understanding that becomes part of how you see things, not something you think about constantly. That's how important things last. They don't demand attention. They earn space. Space is being given now. On both sides. And within that space, whatever needs to happen next will happen without pressure, without urgency, and without distortion. Because it will be built on awareness instead of denial. That's the real significance of what was left. Not the moment it was noticed, but the way it's now being carried, calmly, honestly, and without resistance. That's not artificial. That's human. It doesn't arrive as a realization this time. It arrives as a pause. The kind of pause that slips in between thoughts, between actions, between one breath and the next. You don't stop because you're confused. You stop because something inside you recognizes that rushing forward would feel wrong. That pause is intentional. What was left has now reached a stage where it no longer needs interpretation. It has moved beyond being something you think about and become something you account for. Like a quiet weight you're aware of when you move, not heavy enough to burden you, but real enough to influence how you step. The person who left it behind has felt this shift too, though not as a dramatic change. More like a steady recalibration. Choices feel slightly different now. Reactions come with more awareness. There's less impulse to fill space unnecessarily. Silence feels more honest than it used to. Before, silence carried tension. It felt like something unfinished or avoided. Now it feels like allowance. Like room being made rather than something being withheld. That distinction matters. Allowance creates space without pressure. It lets things breathe. It lets truth exist without needing to be framed or justified. What was left behind created this allowance, not just externally, but internally as well. Internally is where the real shift happened. There's a noticeable difference in how emotions are being processed now. Less defensiveness. Less internal arguing. When a feeling arises, it's acknowledged instead of immediately evaluated or suppressed. Acknowledgement doesn't amplify emotion. It stabilizes it. That's something the one who left this had to learn slowly. There was a time when any strong feeling felt dangerous, like it would take over if not controlled. Control became the default response. Over time, that control turned into distance. Distance protected, but it also isolated. What was left behind was an act of closing that distance just enough to allow honesty without overwhelm. Not everything had to be said. Not everything had to be opened all at once. Just enough truth to stop pretending. Pretending is what drained the most energy. Since leaving it, there's been more energy available. Not excitement, not adrenaline. A quieter energy. The kind that comes from not fighting yourself anymore. That energy changes how life feels. Daily interactions feel less performative. Conversations feel less guarded. There's no constant monitoring of how much to reveal or conceal. The internal filter has loosened. Loosening doesn't mean spilling everything. It means trusting discernment instead of fear. Discernment knows when to speak and when to stay quiet. Fear speaks either too much or not at all. Fear isn't driving this anymore. You might notice that your own responses to this situation feel different now too. Less urgency to define where it's going. Less temptation to assign meaning prematurely. More comfort with letting it be what it is without needing it to become something else immediately. That comfort is new. It doesn't come from indifference. It comes from confidence in your own ability to handle whatever clarity eventually arrives. Confidence that you don't need to rush to feel secure. Security doesn't come from answers alone. It comes from self-trust. Self-trust grows when you stop ignoring what you feel. What was left has strengthened that trust on both sides. Not by demanding engagement, but by existing without apology. There's also a growing awareness that this moment isn't about escalation. It's about grounding. About making sure that anything that unfolds next does so from a stable foundation. Foundations aren't glamorous. They're necessary. The one who left this understands that now. In the past, there may have been a tendency to chase emotional intensity, mistaking it for connection. Intensity feels alive, but it burns fast. What's happening now feels steadier. Steady doesn't mean boring. It means sustainable. Sustainability requires patience. It requires the ability to tolerate ambiguity without panicking. It requires respect for timing. Timing is being honored here. There's no attempt to push or pull. No subtle pressure disguised as concern. No testing to see how much influence exists. Just presence. Presence is rare because it can't be faked. It requires being okay with not knowing exactly how something will be received or where it will lead. It requires confidence in alignment rather than outcome. Alignment is what feels right now. You might notice moments where this awareness fades into the background, only to return unexpectedly. That's not regression. That's integration at work. Integration isn't constant focus. It's incorporation. Once something is integrated, it doesn't need constant attention. It simply becomes part of how you understand yourself and your connections.
They need to be understood. Understanding takes time, and the time is being given without resentment. That's a significant. Resentment usually shows up when someone feels owed an outcome. There's no sense of being owed here, just a sense of having actually truthfully. Truthful actions tend to stand on their own. You may find that this is the subtly change how you view other area of your life. Where else have you been minimizing something important because it didn't fit neatly? Where else have you been waiting for louder signal instead of trusting quieter ones? Those questions arise naturally one now, not as accusations, as invitations. Invitation to live with more awareness. What was left wasn't just about a connection between two people. It was about modeling a different way of relating to truth, a way that doesn't rely on extreme or avoidance. That model is taking hold. There also understanding now that if conversation happens, it will happen differently. Grounded conversation doesn't rush to conclusions. They allow nuance. They allow pauses. They allow honesty without immediate resolutions. Resolution is overrated. What matters more is coherence. Coherence between what's felt, what's acknowledged, and what's expressed. That coherence is developing now. You don't need to prepare for it. You don't need to rehearse. Whatever needs to be said will emerge naturally when the conditions are right. For now, what's important is not ongoing what's been established. Undoing would be dismissing the significance of what you felt, minimizing it, rationalizing it away. That doesn't feel right anymore. What feels right is allowing this to remain part of your internal landscape without anxiety, letting it inform you without controlling you. Control isn't necessary when trust is present. Trust exists here, not blind trust, earned trust, earned through honesty, restraint, and respect. The person who left the has come to understand that sometimes the most meaningful thing you can do is Stop pretending that something doesn't matter and step back enough to let it breathe. Breathing room is what this has now. Room to evolve, room to clarify, room to remain undefined until definitions serve rather than limit. This stage of a story isn't loud, it's a dramatic, it doesn't come with declaration or decision, it comes with steadiness. Steadiness is often mistaken for lack of moment, but is actually preparation. It's grounded settling before something solid is built. Something solid doesn't trust. Turning toward is gentle is enough, gentleness doesn't weaken meaning. And whatever unfolds next, whenever it unfolds, it will do. Form is place of quiet alignment rather than urgency or fear. That's the difference now. That's what his part represents. Not a turning point marked by action, but a settling point marked by truth. Being allowed to stay. And truth once settled doesn't disappear. It simply waits calmly, honestly, and without pressure for whatever comes next to meet it with the same integrity. That's the story in here. I hope you like this story, you enjoy this story. If you enjoy, drop a like to this video and subscribe to my channel and comment if you like Jesus, comment to this video.